This was actually a concept that was recognized by two women. Ironically, it was two women who first wrote on this kind of concept in 1976, but it was not picked up mostly until the 1980s. And some of you probably have heard of Dr. Richard Gardner, who was somebody who said, okay, we have to look at this concept of somebody trying to alienate their child from the other parent. And Dr. Richard Gardner said, we can make this scientific. And again, thinking about evidence so much as I have been in the last year, thinking, ooh, this sounds great. We have a scientific way to determine if somebody is alienating the child from the other parent. And this was something that Richard Gardner had coined in the 1980s, and he had actually called it parental alienation syndrome, PAS. And he said this was a syndrome that we had to recognize. And for many years, people have tried to get this within the DSM. It still is not within the DSM to recognize this concept, to say, absolutely, this exists and children can be turned against the other parent. And he said, this looks like a brainwashing kind of situation where you program a child to vilify and become hostile towards the other parent or the alienated parent in the situation. And I know lots of you have done work on this topic as well. And he was referring to a disturbance in which children are obsessed with the deprecation and criticism of the parent, denigration that is unjustified and or exaggerated. So when I first heard of this topic, I had heard of a case in Canada where one parent had wanted to alienate her son against his father. So she had said to the child, your father's a terrorist, he's going back to his home country, you can never talk to this person again, your father's a terrible person. So this is kind of the concept that we were talking about in the early days of parental alienation syndrome and Richard Gardner. Now, Richard Gardner took it a whole nother step, that's saying about 90% of the children who are engaged in custody litigation suffered from parental alienation syndrome. And again, this has been much questioned in today's research. To Richard Gardner's credit at different points, he had said that if there is actual parental abuse in a situation, there is no parental alienation syndrome. Again, this has kind of gone away over time, that lots of the cases that we're seeing in the Canadian court system have to do with alienation and with abuse in the same cases. His thought of where there is actual abuse, and again, him saying that there is justified abuse, perhaps is too simplistic. And his solution to this problem was to transfer the child to the home of the so-called hated parent. So he wanted a complete reversal of custody. And again, being somebody who really studies this kinds of concepts, how to control other people, this is something that I thought, okay, there can be something to this topic. There can be something there that's going on, but is it really that simple? Is this really so black and white? Is this the evidence that we're really looking for? Richard Gardner ended up writing multitudes on this area, and was very much known for pretty much this particular syndrome that he'd recognized. And he very much prided himself on being an expert in court. Anybody who knows about the American justice system knows that there's a Frye test for admissibility, and he had been able to get parental alienation recognized by American courts then as well. And he had testified all over the US. However, as more people tried to look into this topic, and many of you have written on this topic, they became extremely critical of this scientific basis of this research. And some great Canadian researchers, Michael Sanny being one of them, had looked at these studies saying that there's inadequate assessment instruments, biased selection of subjects, lack of adequate comparison groups, inadequate statistical analyses, and circular reasoning in a lot of this work that Dr. Gardner had done at the beginning. So again, in our quest to say, okay, how can we prove this? We've almost shot ourselves in the foot at this point. Now, Dr. Gardner also is known for some of his work on pedophilia, and a lot of feminist researchers have felt that he has done a lot of misogynistic work then as well. And he actually died by suicide in 2003. Now, trying to learn more about Richard Gardner has been very difficult to do, as I've tried to do a deep dive into who he was. His obituary in the New York Times originally identified him as a professor of child psychiatry at the College of Physicians and Surgeons at Columbia, but they later did a correction to his obituary saying that he was actually an unpaid volunteer and not a professor of child psychiatry. So it's a very odd situation. A lot of really great researchers like Joan Meyer had said that he was loosely related to Columbia Medical School, but had his own practice. So the numbers that he was basing a lot of his research on, which was mostly self-published, he had his own publishing company as well, which I'm like, ooh, that's a great idea. I should get myself my own publishing company. But a lot of this work was self-published on patients that he had before him, a very small group of patients that he saw. So looking at this, there's a huge tenuous basis that this is all built on, what parental alienation is. But as I found over the last year, there are thousands of books, book chapters, articles, as was said by Jennifer Harman, across 35 countries and 6 continents. So this isn't just a little concept that caught on in North America or caught on in the UK. This is something we're seeing around the world right now. And one of the most interesting parts of this is Linda Nielsen, who has written a ton on this topic as well. She has said it's become more of a legal than a social science and child well-being concept in Canada. And this is what is really scaring me as well, of not having social scientists and researchers who are doing quantitative research on this topic say that this is something that the court should do. It's become recognized in Canada, it's within our process as well, and it's there to stay. Many have said there's nothing more polarizing in the family law field than domestic abuse and parental alienation. You know, I'm really glad to get that point a year into my research then as well, but it is so contentious, and researchers on both sides of the argument keep going back and forth, and it's a lot of name calling at times of saying, you're right, I'm wrong, and back and forth, vice versa, without getting to some of the basics of what we need to do here and to remember the children that are involved. It's become extremely common in cases, and this is something I've learned over the last year, that where there are allegations of family violence and IPV and interpersonal violence, as we use the term a lot in Canada, there is a lot of return of an allegation of parental alienation. And what many of the researchers, Canadian researchers, American researchers, are saying that children will be harmed by judges applying these theories without fully understanding the nuances or limitations. There's so much to understand about parental alienation that we need to think about. And what was one of the most alarming things that I had learned over that last year are many lawyers in Canada and the US are actually telling their clients not to bring up any violence that has occurred against them, because there might be an allegation of parental alienation that is lobbed back on them. And this is going to be proof of their alienation by them raising any of the specter of interpersonal violence in their lives. Great movie. I don't know if anybody's seen this documentary. I actually went to a screening by Brunel University early this year about this film called What Doesn't Kill Me. And it's many women's stories of domestic violence within their relationships. And when they've brought up domestic violence within their custody cases, their spouse has brought up parental alienation and has neutralized that concept of domestic violence that they experienced. And they talk about going into women's shelters in the US and them saying, do not talk about the abuse that you suffered within your marriage. Do not talk about it. You're going to have your children taken away from you. And that was one of the first times I'd seen it in those stark terms of what was happening around the world when it comes to this. And we've had a lot of now qualitative studies that have looked at the numbers, and US courts, this US study that Joan Meyer had done said, the courts are significantly less likely to credit abuse claims when fathers invoke parental alienation. These correlations show that fathers' alienation claims are remarkably effective in undermining or discrediting a mother's allegations of child abuse. When a father claims a mother is alienating the children from him, a mother's abuse claim is 2.3 times more likely to be credited. So we have this quantitative research that's saying that this is something that is being used as this weapon within family law cases as well. And we've had some great work. Simon Lepere and Isabelle Cote from Canada have said they have absolutely seen this in the province of Quebec, where there are some serious concerns that in fact, going back with an allegation of parental alienation is completely neutralizing the domestic violence that happened within that relationship then as well.